Some people think success is about climbing ladders, but I learned it's about building your own staircase while they're busy kicking you down theirs. My name is Emma, and from wherever you're watching this, I need you to stay with me because what I'm about to tell you will change how you see sacrifice, family, and the power of betting on yourself when everyone else counts you out. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Picture this: a boardroom in downtown Chicago, mahogany table, stretching like a runway, and me sitting at the head of it wearing a custom blazer that cost more than my old monthly salary. Across from me sat 3 men in identical navy suits, each one representing a different investment firm, and they all wanted the same thing: my company. The business my former in-laws once called Emma's Little Craft Project had just been valued at $890 million. And these sharks were circling with acquisition offers that would make me one of the wealthiest women in Illinois. I should have felt triumphant, vindicated, maybe even a little smug. But mostly, I felt quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after years of noise, after years of being told to shrink so others could expand. Patricia Morrison, my ex-mother-in-law, had spent 5 years convincing me that my marketing career was selfish, that real wives support their husbands by staying home, that my weekend jewelry hobby was cute but hardly serious. She'd laughed when I first started selling handmade pieces at local markets, called it my arts and crafts phase at family dinners, while her son Michael nodded along like a well-trained puppet. Now, as I signed papers that would net me more money than the Morrison family had seen in 3 generations, I thought about that last Christmas dinner when Patricia had cornered me in her pristine kitchen. "Emma, dear," she'd said with that saccharine smile that never reached her eyes, "you know Michael's career is really taking off now. Don't you think it's time to focus on being the wife he deserves? All this working late and traveling for client meetings, it's just not sustainable for a marriage." I'd folded like origami, quit my 6-figure marketing position 2 weeks later, and spent the next 3 years being the perfect Morrison wife, while my soul slowly starved. But they never suspected that every time they dismissed my little hobby, every time they rolled their eyes when I talked about my jewelry designs, every time they made me feel small for wanting something of my own, I was building something magnificent in the shadows. Something that would eventually buy and sell their precious family legacy 10 times over. The thing about being underestimated is that it gives you incredible freedom to move unseen. While Patricia was busy planning my entire life around her son's needs, while Robert Morrison pontificated about traditional family values over Sunday roast, while Michael grew comfortable with a wife who'd traded her ambitions for his approval, I was learning everything I could about e-commerce, supply chains, brand building, and scaling a business from the ground up. My marketing background wasn't wasted after all. It was just redirected into something they couldn't control or diminish. 3 years of playing the perfect daughter-in-law taught me that some people don't want partners. They want accessories. Beautiful, compliant accessories that make them look good at dinner parties and never overshadow them in mixed company. Patricia wanted a daughter-in-law who would produce grandchildren on schedule, host flawless holidays, and defer to the Morrison name in all things. Michael wanted a wife who would celebrate his promotions without mentioning her own abandoned dreams, who would relocate for his career opportunities without questioning what she was leaving behind, who would make his life easier by making her own life smaller. I gave them exactly what they thought they wanted, and in return, they gave me something invaluable: the crystal-clear understanding that I was on my own. That realization didn't come all at once. It crept in slowly, through 1,000 tiny paper cuts disguised as family concern. Like when Patricia suggested I stop mentioning my old job at parties because it makes Michael look bad, like he can't provide for you. Or when Robert asked why I needed my own bank account when Michael's salary was more than sufficient for both of you. Or when Michael himself started introducing me as just my wife instead of by name, as if I'd become a role rather than a person. The jewelry business started as genuine therapy. After quitting Morrison & Associates, where I'd managed multi-million-dollar campaigns for Fortune 500 companies, I needed something to do with my hands, something beautiful to counteract the ugly feeling of having erased myself for someone else's. Comfort. I'd always loved working with my hands, sketching designs, playing with colors and textures. As a kid, I'd made friendship bracelets for my entire 6th grade class. In college, I designed custom pieces for sorority formals. It was the one creative outlet I'd never been able to fully abandon, even during my most intense corporate years. I started small, really small. I converted the spare bedroom in Michael's and my townhouse into a tiny studio space. I bought basic supplies with money from my severance package, money that Patricia suggested should go toward home improvements that would benefit the whole family. Instead, I bought silver wire, gemstone beads, chains, clasps, and a small toolkit. Those first pieces were rough, imperfect, but they were mine in a way nothing had been mine for months. Michael was patronizingly supportive in the beginning. He'd pat my head when I showed him a new design, call it cute, suggest I sell them at the local farmer's market if it made me happy. Patricia was less subtle in her dismissal. "Oh, Emma's playing jewelry maker now," she'd announce to visitors. "It keeps her busy while Michael's at work. Better than watching soap operas, I suppose." She'd examine my pieces with the same expression she reserved for suspicious leftovers, holding them at arm's length as if creativity might be contagious. But here's what they didn't understand about a woman who'd spent years managing marketing, budgets, and launching product campaigns. I knew how to scale. I understood target demographics, brand positioning, social media strategy, and customer acquisition. My little hobby wasn't random craft projects thrown together in my spare time. It was a carefully researched, strategically planned business venture that I was building with the same professional intensity I'd once applied to corporate clients. Within 6 months, I'd sold over $3,000 worth of jewelry through Instagram and a basic website I'd built myself. The Morrison family found this mildly amusing. Patricia joked that I was making pin money like women used to do with their sewing circles. Michael suggested I save up for something nice for the house, maybe new curtains for the living room. They thought $3,000 was the ceiling, not the foundation. By month 8, I was grossing $15,000 a month and had hired my first part-time assistant, Jessica, a recent art school graduate who understood my vision and could help with production. The Morrisons were less amused now. Patricia started making comments about how much time I was spending on that business thing, and whether it was fair to neglect household responsibilities for what was still essentially a hobby. Michael began complaining that I was always on my phone, always talking about inventory and shipping deadlines and customer feedback. They wanted me busy enough to stay out of trouble, but not so busy that I forgot my primary job was being a Morrison wife. The turning point came during year 2 when I landed my first major wholesale contract. A boutique chain in California wanted to carry my signature line in 47 stores across the state. The initial order was worth $200,000, more money than Michael made in 4 months at his accounting firm. I was so excited I could barely contain myself. I'd done this. I'd built something real, something valuable, something that proved I was more than just a decorative addition to someone else's life. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I told Michael first, expecting him to be proud, maybe even a little impressed. Instead, he looked troubled. "Emma, this is getting out of hand," he said. "You're talking about this like it's a real business now. What happens when you get overwhelmed? What happens when you can't keep up with all these orders? You'll embarrass yourself, and by extension, you'll embarrass me." That night, he called his parents. I could hear him in the kitchen, speaking in low, concerned tones about my obsession with the jewelry business and how it was affecting our marriage. Patricia arrived the next morning with homemade muffins and a lecture about knowing when to quit while you're ahead. Success can be just as dangerous as failure, dear, she told me over coffee. You don't want to bite off more than you can chew. Michael needs a wife who's present, not someone chasing pipe dreams. Robert was more direct. Emma, you're a smart girl, but you're not a businesswoman. There's a difference. This little enterprise of yours is fine as a hobby, but don't confuse beginner's luck with actual business acumen. The smart thing would be to cash out now, before you lose everything and make Michael look foolish for letting it go this far. They were scared. I realized it suddenly, sitting in Patricia's perfect living room, surrounded by family photos where Michael's achievements were displayed like trophies, and my entire identity had been reduced to Michael's wife in carefully scripted Christmas card signatures. They were scared because I was succeeding at something they couldn't control, couldn't diminish, couldn't claim credit for. My success made their narrative about my limitations look like the lie it had always been. But I was still trying to be the good wife, the cooperative daughter-in-law, the woman who didn't rock boats or make waves. So I listened to their concerns, nodded thoughtfully, and promised to be more careful about managing my time and expectations. I took the wholesale contract anyway, but I stopped talking about it at family dinners. I hired 2 more assistants, but told the Morrisons I was scaling back to focus on my marriage. I let them believe what they needed to believe while I quietly built an empire in the spaces between their expectations. Year 3 was when everything changed, when I stopped trying to make myself smaller to fit their comfort zone and started focusing entirely on the business that was outgrowing every container they tried to put it in. The California boutique contract led to contracts in New York, Texas, and Florida. Fashion bloggers started featuring my pieces. Celebrities began wearing my designs to red carpet events. I was grossing $70,000 a month and had 6 full-time employees working out of a warehouse space I'd rented across town. The Morrisons knew something was happening, but I'd gotten very good at deflecting their questions. When Patricia asked about all the packages being delivered to the house, I told her I was ordering supplies in bulk to save money. When Michael noticed I was gone more often, I said I was meeting with local vendors and suppliers. When Robert wondered aloud about the expensive camera equipment I'd bought for product photography, I explained that good photos were essential for online sales, as if I were still selling $20 bracelets to friends on Facebook. The truth was, I was protecting my success from their interference. I'd learned that the Morrison family had a way of taking over anything good in my life and making it about them. If they knew how well the business was really doing, Patricia would want to manage the marketing strategy. Robert would want to restructure my finances and legal setup. Michael would want credit for supporting my entrepreneurial phase and expect me to scale back so he could feel like the primary breadwinner. Again. Instead, I let them think I was still playing dress-up in the business world, while I quietly built something they couldn't touch, couldn't diminish, and couldn't take away. I was learning that the most dangerous thing you can do to people who need you to stay small is to grow where they can't see you, because by the time they notice, it's already too late to stop you. By the end of year 3, I was running a multi-million-dollar operation with 22 employees, partnerships with major retailers, and a celebrity clientele that included A-list actresses and influential social media personalities. My designs were being featured in Vogue and Harper's Bazaar. Business schools were studying my growth strategy as a case study in organic scaling and social media marketing. And Michael Morrison still thought I was making jewelry in the spare bedroom for fun money. The cognitive dissonance was becoming harder to maintain. I was flying to New York for Fashion Week meetings while telling my husband I was visiting a friend for the weekend. I was negotiating 6-figure licensing deals while sitting in Patricia's living room pretending to care about her opinions on proper table settings. I was building a business empire while playing the role of the grateful daughter-in-law who was so lucky to have married into such a successful family. But the most surreal part wasn't the deception. It was how invisible I'd become to them, even as I was becoming more successful than they'd ever dreamed of being. They saw what they expected to see. A woman who'd given up her career to support her husband, a wife who'd found a harmless creative outlet to pass the time, a Morrison family member who knew her place in the hierarchy. They never looked close enough to see the woman who was quietly revolutionizing an entire industry while they planned her life around their son's mediocre accounting career. The end was coming, though I didn't know it yet. You can only live a double life for so long before the two versions of yourself demand to occupy the same space. And when that happens, when your secret success collides with their public expectations, everything changes. The people who needed you to stay small will do anything to cut you back down to size. But by then, if you've built your foundation strong enough, there's nothing left for them to cut. The Morrison family had a way of making generosity feel like ownership. I learned this gradually, through 1,000 small surrenders that felt reasonable in the moment, but added up to something suffocating. Over time, it started with Michael's proposal itself, which happened not in some romantic setting chosen by us, but during Sunday dinner at Patricia and Robert's house, orchestrated like a family board meeting where my acceptance was assumed rather than requested. "We've been talking," Patricia had said, setting down her famous apple pie with the kind of theatrical flourish that announced important family business. "And we think it's time Michael settled down properly. With the right kind of woman, of course." She'd smiled at me then, but it felt more like an assessment than affection. "Emma seems like she could fit in well with our family values." I should have paid more attention to the phrasing, not, "We hope you'll be happy together," or "We're excited to welcome Emma to the family." It was, "She could fit in well," as if I were applying for a position rather than marrying the man I loved. As if my value was determined entirely by how well I could adapt to their existing structure, rather than what I might bring to it. Michael had proposed right there at the dinner table, pulling out a ring that Patricia had obviously helped select, asking me to marry him while his parents beamed like proud directors watching their carefully staged production unfold exactly as planned. I said yes because I loved him, because I thought his family's involvement meant they cared about our happiness, because I was young enough to mistake control for concern. The engagement period was my first real education in Morrison family dynamics. Every decision, from the venue to the flowers to the guest list, had to be discussed with Patricia first. "We want to make sure everything reflects well on the family," she'd explain whenever I suggested something that deviated from her vision. "The Morrison name has a certain reputation in this community, and your wedding will be a reflection of our values." My own mother, a soft-spoken woman who'd raised 3 daughters mostly on her own after my father died, tried to participate in the planning, but was gradually edged out by Patricia's forceful certainty about every detail. "I'm sure your mother has lovely ideas, dear," Patricia would say with that smile that felt like a pat on the head. "But she might not understand the expectations that come with marrying into a family like ours." I watched my mother shrink a little more at each planning meeting, her suggestions dismissed as quaint or impractical, her offers to contribute financially waved away as unnecessary since the Morrisons always take care of their own. By the time we sent out invitations, the wedding looked nothing like anything I'd ever dreamed of and everything like a Morrison family showcase with me as the featured accessory. The morning of the wedding, as I sat in a hotel room getting ready, my mother held my hands and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Emma, honey," she said quietly, "are you sure this is what you want? Not the marriage, I know. You love Michael. But all of this?" She gestured toward the elaborate dress Patricia had insisted upon, the formal hairstyle that felt like a costume, the schedule of events that had been planned down to the minute. "You seem like you're disappearing, a little." I laughed it off then, told her it was normal pre-wedding nerves, assured her that I was happy. But her words stuck with me as I walked down an aisle lined with flowers I hadn't chosen toward a man I loved, but barely recognized in his family's elaborate staging of our most intimate moment. The whole ceremony felt like I was watching someone else get married, someone who looked like me but made choices I wouldn't have made. The honeymoon was our first real time alone together in months, and I thought maybe we could find our way back to the relationship we'd had before his family had taken over every aspect of our lives. But even in Tuscany, far from Patricia's daily phone calls and Robert's dinner table lectures, Michael seemed to be performing his role as the Morrison son, rather than simply being the man I'd fallen in love with. He took photos of every meal to send to his mother, called home every other day to report on our activities, spent hours researching restaurants and tours that he thought would impress his parents when we told them about the trip later. "Mom's gonna love hearing about this place," he'd say, or "Dad will get a kick out of that story." It was as if we were experiencing our honeymoon through the lens of how it would play at future family dinners, rather than creating memories for ourselves. When we returned to Chicago, the real work of being a Morrison wife began. Patricia had already selected our first apartment, a place in her preferred neighborhood that was close enough for regular visits, but expensive enough to ensure we'd need financial help from the family. "Just until you two get established," Robert explained as he co-signed our lease. "Think of it as an investment in your future together." I should have recognized the golden handcuffs for what they were, but I was still operating under the assumption that family support was offered freely rather than as a means of maintaining control. I didn't understand yet that every favor came with invisible strings attached. Every act of generosity was also an act of ownership. My own career was flourishing at the time. I'd been promoted to senior marketing manager at Morrison & Associates, a coincidence of names that Patricia never tired of pointing out as evidence that our marriage was meant to be. I was managing campaigns for major clients, traveling frequently for presentations and strategy meetings, working late nights on projects that challenged and excited me. I loved the work, loved the recognition I was earning from colleagues and clients, loved the financial independence that came with a six-figure salary. But the Morrison family had different ideas about what my career should look like now that I was married to their son. The comments started small, seemingly casual observations that felt more like suggestions than demands. Patricia would mention how tired I looked after a particularly intense work week, how Michael seemed lonely when I traveled for business, how nice it would be when I could focus more on building a home together. Robert was more direct in his concerns about my career trajectory. "Emma, you're a smart girl, but you need to think strategically about your future," he'd tell me during those long Sunday dinners that had become mandatory family gatherings. "Michael's career is really taking off now. He's on track to make partner at his firm, and when that happens, you'll need to be available to support him properly. All this traveling and working late, it's not sustainable for a wife in your position." Your position. As if being married to Michael had fundamentally changed not just my relationship status, but my entire identity and purpose. As if my own career accomplishments were now secondary to my role as supporting cast in his professional development. Michael himself seemed torn between pride in my success and discomfort with the attention it brought me. He'd brag about my achievements to his friends, but then make subtle jokes about my work obsession when I had to miss social events for client meetings. He'd encourage me to negotiate for better salaries and benefits, but then complain that I was never home anymore, that our apartment felt empty without me there to make it feel like a home. The pressure intensified when Michael was indeed promoted to senior associate at his accounting firm. The celebration dinner at Patricia and Robert's house became a strategy session about how this advancement would affect our family's future plans. Patricia had already researched the wives of Michael's new colleagues, determining what social obligations would be expected of me, what charity boards I should consider joining, what kind of entertaining we'd need to do to support his continued ascent in the company. "This is such an exciting opportunity for both of you," she said, though her focus was entirely on Michael as she spoke. "But it's going to require some adjustments. Emma, dear, you'll need to be much more available now. Michael's going to need a wife who can attend company functions, host client dinners, maybe even do some traveling with him when he has important presentations out of town." I pointed out that my own travel schedule was already quite demanding. that I had responsibilities to my clients and my own career development to consider. Patricia's expression cooled noticeably. "Well, of course, your little job is important, too," she said with the kind of smile that felt like a slap. "But you have to be realistic about priorities now. Michael's career has much more potential for growth, and a wife's job is to maximize her husband's opportunities, not compete with them. Your little job, as if managing multi-million-dollar marketing campaigns for Fortune 500 companies was some kind of part-time distraction rather than a legitimate career that I'd worked years to build. As if my professional accomplishments were somehow diminished by my marriage to her son. As if success only counted when it happened to people named Morrison. The final push came during a family vacation to Robert's lake house in Wisconsin. I'd had to skip the first 2 days of the trip for a crucial client presentation, something that had been scheduled months in advance and couldn't be moved. When I finally arrived at the lake house, the mood was decidedly chilly. Patricia barely looked up from her book when I walked onto the deck where the family was gathered for afternoon drinks. "Oh, Emma," she said with exaggerated surprise, as if she'd forgotten I was coming. "I wondered if you were going to make it at all. Michael's been so disappointed. We've been having such a lovely time as a family." Michael himself seemed different, more distant than usual. That night, as we walked along the lake shore, he finally voiced what had obviously been building for months. "Emma, I need to ask you something, and I need you to really think about your answer," he said. "What's more important to you, your career or our marriage?" The question felt like a trap, like there was only one acceptable answer and anything else would prove I was selfish and uncommitted to our relationship. I tried to explain that it shouldn't be an either-or choice, that plenty of couples manage dual careers successfully, that my work was part of who I was and not something I could simply set aside without losing essential pieces of myself. But Michael had been well coached by his family. "I'm not asking you to give up working entirely," he said, though his tone suggested this was a significant concession. "I'm just asking you to be realistic about what really matters. My career can support us both. Your career is adding stress and complications that we don't need. Wouldn't you rather focus on building something together instead of always being pulled in different directions? Building something together." It sounded romantic, collaborative, like a shared adventure we'd embark on as equal partners. What it really meant was that I should subsume my ambitions into his, that together was a euphemism for in service of Michael's goals. The conversation continued for hours, circling through the same arguments with Patricia and Robert's voices, echoing in Michael's reasoning. I was being selfish by prioritizing my career over family harmony. I was being unrealistic about the demands of being a proper wife to someone in Michael's position. I was being stubborn by refusing to see the bigger picture of what our life together could look like if I just trusted their vision for our future. By the end of the vacation, I was exhausted from defending my right to have my own career, tired of being made to feel like my professional success was somehow a betrayal of my marriage vows. The Morrison family had worn me down through sheer persistence, making their unreasonable demands feel reasonable through constant repetition and emotional manipulation. I didn't quit my job immediately. The decision came gradually, through a series of smaller surrenders that felt like compromises at the time, but added up to complete capitulation. First, I turned down a promotion that would have required more travel. Then I stopped volunteering for high-profile projects that might demand weekend work. Then I began declining invitations to industry conferences and networking events that conflicted with Morrison family obligations. Each concession was presented as a temporary adjustment, a short-term sacrifice for long-term family harmony, but each one also made me smaller in my own professional world, less visible to clients and colleagues, less essential to the projects and campaigns that had once energized me. I was slowly erasing myself from my own career, and the Morrison family was there to applaud each erasure as evidence of my growing maturity and commitment to proper family values. The final straw came during Michael's company Christmas party. I'd been looking forward to the event, seeing it as an opportunity to meet his colleagues and their spouses, to be part of his professional world the way he'd never really been part of mine. I'd bought a new dress, researched the company's recent achievements so I could make intelligent conversation, prepared to be the kind of supportive spouse who enhanced rather than overshadowed her partner's professional image. But at the party, I discovered that Patricia had already been talking to the other wives, positioning herself as the family matriarch and me as the daughter-in-law who was still learning how to be a proper corporate wife. Emma's still adjusting to married life, I overheard her telling Michael's boss's wife. She's been so focused on her own little career that she's only just beginning to understand what it means to support a husband properly, but she's learning. She was rewriting my story even as I was living it, turning my professional accomplishments into evidence of immaturity rather than capability, making my reluctance to abandon my career sound like selfishness rather than self-preservation. And Michael, standing nearby with a drink in his hand, just nodded along as if this characterization of his wife was not only accurate, but preferable to the truth. That night, driving home from the party, I finally understood what my mother had seen on my wedding day. I was disappearing, not all at once, but piece by piece, choice by choice, concession by concession. The woman who'd built a successful marketing career was being replaced by someone who smiled and nodded and deferred to other people's opinions about what her life should look like. 2 weeks later, I submitted my resignation letter to Morrison and Associates. The official reason was to focus on family and explore new opportunities. The real reason was that I was tired of fighting for my right to exist as something more than Michael Morrison's wife. I thought maybe if I gave them what they wanted, if I proved my commitment to their vision of family life, I'd find some peace in surrender. I was wrong, of course. Giving up my career didn't earn me respect or acceptance or even gratitude from the Morrison family. It just proved to them that I was malleable, that my boundaries were negotiable, that with enough pressure and persistence, they could reshape me into whatever version of Emma best served their needs. What I got instead of peace was a different kind of prison, one made of golden expectations and suffocating care. I'd traded my professional identity for the promise of belonging to something bigger than myself, only to discover that belonging to the Morrison family meant disappearing into their shadow rather than finding my place in their light. But sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do to someone is give them everything they think they want. Because when you strip away a person's resistance, when you remove all the external structures that define their sense of self, you don't create a grateful dependent. You create someone with nothing left to lose and unlimited time to figure out what they really want to build. The moment I handed in my resignation, I expected relief. I thought giving the Morrison family what they wanted would finally earn me the acceptance I'd been craving, that sacrificing my career would prove my commitment to their version of family harmony. Instead, I discovered that surrender doesn't buy you peace with people who see compromise as weakness. It just gives them permission to ask for more. Within a month of leaving my job, Patricia had a whole new list of ways I could better support Michael's ascending career. "Now that you have more time," she'd say with that bright smile that always preceded a demand, "you could really help Michael shine at these company functions. The partners' wives are very involved in the social side of business development. There are committees you should join, charity galas you should organize, dinner parties you should host." She made it sound like an exciting opportunity rather than an assignment, but her expectations were crystal clear. I was to become Michael's professional accessory, the charming wife who remembered everyone's names, who could make small talk about wine and vacation destinations, who would enhance his reputation through careful performance of upper-middle class femininity. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was supposed to use all the skills I'd developed in my marketing career, networking, relationship building, strategic communication to advance someone else's ambitions while abandoning my own. But pointing this out to Patricia only earned me lectures about the difference between real contribution to family success and selfish individual pursuits. Michael seemed genuinely surprised by how quickly I adapted to unemployment. He'd expected me to struggle more with the transition, maybe even to appreciate his family's support more once I realized how lost I felt without the structure of office life. Instead, he found me oddly energized by my newfound freedom, excited about possibilities he couldn't quite understand. "What are you going to do with all this time?" he asked one evening, finding me sketching jewelry designs at the kitchen table. I'd been drawing since childhood, but it had been years since I'd had hours to just sit and create without deadline pressure or client requirements shaping every decision. "I'm thinking about making some of these," I said, showing him pages of earring and necklace designs I'd been working on, maybe selling them online or at local markets, just for fun, to have something creative to focus on. He'd smiled indulgently, the way you smile at a child who announces they want to be an astronaut. "That sounds nice, honey, like a hobby. Just don't get too carried away with it, okay? You've got more important things to focus on now." More important things, like planning dinner parties for his colleagues, like memorizing the names and interests of partners' wives, like ensuring our apartment was always presentable for the impromptu visits Patricia had started making now that she knew I'd be home to receive them. But while Michael and his family were busy congratulating themselves on successfully domesticating me, I was discovering something they hadn't anticipated. Without the constant demands of a high-pressure corporate job, without the exhaustion of defending my right to have my own career, I had mental space for the first time in years. And in that space, I began to see my situation with uncomfortable clarity. I started paying attention to how the Morrison family actually functioned, not as the loving unit they presented to the world, but as a complex system of power and control disguised as care and concern. Patricia's constant involvement in our lives wasn't maternal affection, it was management. Robert's financial support wasn't generosity, it was leverage. Michael's expectation that I prioritize his career wasn't partnership, it was ownership. The realization came gradually, through a series of small observations that accumulated into an undeniable pattern. Like how Patricia would call every morning to discuss my plans for the day, not because she was interested in my activities, but because she wanted to ensure I wasn't making decisions without family input. Or how Robert would make comments about our investment in your future whenever I expressed preferences that differed from family consensus. Or how Michael had started making decisions about our social calendar, our finances, even our weekend plans without consulting me, as if my resignation from work had also been a resignation from equal partnership in our marriage. The jewelry making started as genuine escape from this suffocating oversight, but it quickly became something more significant. Working with my hands, creating something beautiful from raw materials, making decisions based entirely on my own aesthetic vision rather than committee approval. These activities reminded me of who I'd been before I'd gotten lost in the Morrison family's expectations. My first pieces were rough, imperfect, but they were mine in a way nothing had been mine for months. I wasn't creating them to impress anyone or to meet external standards. I was making them because the process brought me joy, because completing a design gave me a sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval. I started small, selling a few pieces to friends and coworkers from my old job. $20 for simple earrings, $50 for more elaborate necklaces. The money wasn't the point, though the Morrison family seemed to think it was. Patricia found my modest sales amusing rather than impressive. "How nice that your little hobby is paying for itself," she'd say, like a lemonade stand for adults. But what she didn't understand was that those $20 sales represented something revolutionary in my current life. They were transactions. Where my work was valued by people who had chosen to seek it out, who had handed over their own money because they saw worth in something I had created. After months of being told that my value lay entirely in how well I supported other people's endeavors, These small commercial exchanges felt like proof that I still existed as an individual with something unique to offer the world. The breakthrough came during a particularly awful Morrison family dinner, one of those weekly gatherings that had become mandatory since I'd stopped working. Patricia had been holding court about a charity fundraiser she was organizing, discussing seating charts and auction items with the kind of intensity usually reserved for military strategy. I'd been assigned multiple tasks related to the event, all unpaid labor disguised as opportunities to get more involved in community leadership. Michael had been unusually quiet during dinner, and afterward, as we helped clean up, Patricia cornered him in the kitchen. I was in the adjacent dining room, clearing plates, when I overheard their conversation. "She seems to be adjusting well to not working," Patricia was saying. "But I'm concerned about all this jewelry business. It's taking up quite a bit of her time, and she's starting to talk about it like it's serious rather than just a creative outlet." "I know," Michael replied. "She made almost $800 last month. She's getting a little too excited about it." $800. I'd made $800 in a month selling jewelry, and my own husband was discussing this achievement as if it were a problem to be managed rather than a success to be celebrated. They were concerned that I was taking my own work too seriously, worried that I might develop ambitions that extended beyond the narrow lane they'd created for my life. Patricia's response was even more revealing. "You need to nip this in the bud, Michael. I've seen what happens when wives start thinking they can build real businesses. They get distracted from what actually matters. Emma's doing so well with the social aspects of supporting your career. Don't let her jeopardize that progress by chasing fantasies about being an entrepreneur." Fantasies about being an entrepreneur. As if my successful track record in corporate marketing had been erased by my resignation, as if my demonstrated ability to build campaigns and manage budgets and develop strategies somehow didn't translate to the possibility that I might be capable of building something on my own. That night, lying in bed next to Michael, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger exactly, but a kind of crystalline clarity that had been building for months. The Morrison family didn't want me to succeed at anything outside their control. They wanted me grateful, dependent, and small. My happiness was irrelevant as long as I was useful to their vision of how our family should function. I started researching in earnest then, spending hours online learning about jewelry design, manufacturing processes, e-commerce platforms, social media marketing. I read about successful artisan businesses, studied pricing strategies, examined how other creators had scaled from individual sales to larger operations. I was applying the same analytical approach I'd once used for corporate clients to my own emerging business. But this time I was careful not to discuss my research with anyone in the Morrison family. The transformation in my approach yielded immediate results. Instead of making random pieces based on whatever materials I happened to have, I developed signature styles and color palettes. Instead of selling only to friends, I launched an Instagram account and began building a following of strangers who were genuinely interested in my work. Instead of charging whatever felt reasonable, I researched market prices and positioned my pieces competitively within the handmade luxury category. Within 3 months, I was making more than $3,000 a month. Within 6 months, I'd hit $5,000. The Morrison family noticed, of course, but they interpreted my success through their own limited understanding of what I was capable of achieving. "Emma's little business is doing quite well," Patricia would tell her friends as if she were discussing a child's science fair project. "She's making enough to cover her craft supplies and maybe buy herself something nice occasionally. It keeps her busy while Michael's at work." Michael was less dismissive but more controlling. He started asking detailed questions about my income and expenses, suggesting that we should put the profits into our savings account rather than letting me maintain financial independence. "We're married," he'd remind me when I resisted his attempts to manage my earnings. "What's yours is mine, right?" But what's mine is yours apparently didn't work in reverse. Michael's salary, his bonuses, His professional opportunities remained firmly in the category of Morrison family assets, while my business income was treated as discretionary fund money that should be available for family use whenever needed. The real breaking point came during our second wedding anniversary dinner. Michael had made reservations at an expensive restaurant, the kind of place the Morrison family considered appropriate for important celebrations. Patricia and Robert joined us, of course, because significant moments in our marriage were always family affairs rather than private experiences. Over dessert, Robert raised his wine glass for a toast. "To Michael and Emma," he said, "and to how beautifully Emma has grown into her role as a Morrison wife. We're so proud of how she's learned to prioritize what really matters." Patricia clinked her glass enthusiastically. "Yes, and Michael, you've been so patient with Emma's adjustment period. Not every husband would be so understanding about a wife needing time to figure out her proper place in the family." My adjustment period, my proper place. They were talking about me as if I were a rescued pet who'd finally been house-trained, celebrating my successful domestication rather than acknowledging any actual accomplishments or growth on my part. Michael beamed at his parents' approval, raising his own glass. "Emma's really found her groove," he agreed. "She's amazing at all the social stuff now, and her little jewelry hobby is bringing in some nice extra income. She's exactly the kind of wife I always hoped I'd have." Little jewelry hobby, nice extra income. I was making more than $7,000 a month at that point, had a waiting list of customers, and was getting inquiries from boutiques interested in carrying my work. But to my own husband, my growing business was still a little hobby that was valuable primarily because it made me a more interesting accessory to his own life. I smiled and nodded and played my part through the rest of dinner, but something fundamental had crystallized in that moment. The Morrison family would never see me as anything more than a supporting character in their story, no matter how successful I became or how much I contributed to our collective well-being. I could make $10,000 a month, $20,000, $50,000, and they would still talk about my little hobby, as if it were an amusing distraction rather than evidence of my actual capabilities. That night, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. I was going to stop performing the role of grateful Morrison wife and start building something they couldn't control, couldn't diminish, and couldn't take credit for. I was going to scale my little hobby into a real business, not because I wanted to prove anything to them, but because I wanted to prove something to myself. I was going to find out what Emma could accomplish when she stopped trying to fit into other people's definitions of who she should be, and I was going to do it quietly, carefully, without their knowledge or input, so that by the time they realized what I'd built, it would be too late for them to interfere. The jewelry business was about to become much more than a hobby. It was about to become my escape route from a life that had grown too small to contain who I was becoming. But first, I had to learn how to hide my ambitions from people who loved me best when I had none. Building an empire in secret requires a different kind of intelligence than most people realize. It's not just about business acumen or creative vision, though both matter. It's about becoming a master of misdirection, learning to hide your light under a bushel so effectively that the people closest to you never suspect they're living with someone who's quietly revolutionizing an industry while they sleep. I became a student of deflection. When packages arrived daily at our apartment, I told Michael they were craft supplies bought in bulk for better pricing. When I started staying up late working on designs and marketing strategies, I said I was having trouble sleeping and needed something to occupy my mind. When I began scheduling mysterious phone calls and video conferences, I explained them as consultations with other hobby jewelry makers who were helping me improve my techniques. The lies came easier than I expected, partly because they were built on a foundation of truth the Morrison family had created themselves. They'd spent so much time convincing me and everyone else that my capabilities were limited, that my business was insignificant, that my success was temporary luck rather than skill. Their own dismissive assumptions became the perfect camouflage for what I was actually building. By month 8, I was grossing $15,000 monthly and had established relationships with 3 wholesale buyers who wanted to carry my signature collections in their boutiques. The numbers were becoming too large to hide completely, but I'd learned to present them in ways that minimized their impact on the Morrison family's perception of my activities. "How's the jewelry thing going?" Patricia would ask during our weekly coffee meetings, the ones she'd instituted to keep closer tabs on my daily activities. "Oh, it's picking up," I'd reply casually. "I sold quite a few pieces last month, enough to cover my materials and maybe put a little aside for new equipment." This was technically true. I had covered my materials costs, which were now running about $3,000 monthly for the high-quality gemstones and precious metals I was using, and I was putting money aside for new equipment, though new equipment meant industrial-grade tools and a professional photography setup rather than better pliers and a brighter desk lamp. Patricia would nod approvingly, satisfied that my earnings remained at hobby levels rather than threatening to become actual financial independence. "That's wonderful, dear. Just remember not to let it become overwhelming. Michael needs you available for the important social functions coming up this fall." The important social functions. Always the reminder that my primary value lay in supporting Michael's career advancement rather than pursuing my own professional development. These conversations reinforced my growing conviction that the Morrison family would never accept my success if they understood its true scope. They needed me to remain small, manageable, grateful for their guidance and support. So I gave them the version of Emma they could handle while building something entirely different in the spaces they couldn't see. I rented a small warehouse, space across town, telling Michael I was using a friend's garage to store inventory. I hired 3 part-time employees, introducing them to anyone who asked as volunteers from a local arts program who were helping me learn production techniques. I invested in professional web development and social media management, explaining the improved online presence as something I was doing myself during my abundant free time. The deception became more complex as the business grew, but it also became more necessary. I was learning that success brings its own kind of visibility, and visibility was the last thing I wanted while operating under the Morrison family's radar. Fashion bloggers were starting to feature my pieces. Boutique owners were calling to discuss exclusive arrangements. Customers were leaving reviews that used words like investment quality and heirloom pieces rather than cute and affordable. The turning point came when Vivian Torres, the accessories editor at Chicago Magazine, reached out about featuring my work in their annual Local Artisans to Watch profile. This was the kind of publicity that could transform a regional business into a national brand, the sort of opportunity any entrepreneur would celebrate as a major breakthrough. Instead, I felt a spike of panic. Chicago Magazine had significant readership among the professional and social circles the Morrison family moved in. There was no way to accept this feature without risking exposure of how large my operation had actually become. Patricia subscribed to the magazine. Michael's colleagues would see it. The carefully constructed narrative about my little hobby would crumble the moment anyone saw professional photographs of my workshop and read quotes about my business philosophy and growth strategies. I almost declined the interview, almost chose invisibility over opportunity, almost let the Morrison family's need for my smallness override my own potential for expansion. But something had shifted in me during those months of secret building. I'd remembered what it felt like to be excellent at something, to create value that others recognized and willingly paid for, to solve problems and exceed expectations and earn genuine respect for the quality of my work. I accepted the magazine feature, but I negotiated the timing. The issue wouldn't come out for 3 months, which gave me time to prepare for the inevitable confrontation with Michael and his family. Time to document every aspect of my business operations, to secure my legal and financial independence, to build a foundation strong enough to withstand whatever attempts they might make to undermine or control what I'd created. I used those 3 months to accelerate everything. I incorporated the business officially, with myself as sole owner and operator. I moved my operations to a larger warehouse and hired 6 full-time employees. I established relationships with suppliers that would allow me to scale production rapidly if demand increased. I built a war chest of operating capital that would sustain the business through any personal disruptions that might come from the Morrison family discovering my success. Most importantly, I began building relationships outside the Morrison sphere of influence. I joined professional organizations for small business owners and women entrepreneurs. I attended networking events and industry conferences where I met people who knew me only as Emma Hartwell, successful jewelry designer and business owner, rather than Emma Morrison, wife and family accessory. These connections reminded me of who I'd been before marriage had complicated my identity. They treated my business achievements as impressive rather than amusing, my growth strategies as sophisticated rather than lucky, my professional goals as legitimate rather than selfish. For the first time in years, I was spending time with people who expected competence from me rather than grateful compliance. The magazine came out on a Thursday morning in October. I'd arranged to be out of town that day, ostensibly visiting my mother, but actually attending a trade show in Minneapolis where I was meeting with potential national distributors. I wanted to be surrounded by people who understood business when the Morrison family discovered what I'd been hiding. Michael called me at 11 a.m., his voice tight with confusion and something that might have been anger. "Emma, what the hell? Is this magazine article? It says you own a company with 12 employees and annual revenue in the high 6 figures. That can't be right, can it?" High 6 figures. The magazine had been conservative in their estimates, but even their modest projections were 10 times larger than anything I'd ever admitted to my husband. I'd been making more money than Michael for over a year, employing more people than his entire department at the accounting firm, managing more complex operations than he'd ever been trusted with in his career. "The numbers might be a little inflated," I said carefully. "You know how magazines like to make things sound more dramatic than they really are." "Emma." His voice had that tone he used when he thought I was being deliberately obtuse. "The article has photographs of your warehouse. It quotes you talking about expansion plans and investor meetings. There's a sidebar about your marketing strategy. This isn't hobby-level activity." Investor meetings. I hadn't mentioned those to the magazine reporter, but she'd done her research and discovered that 3 different venture capital firms had approached me about potential partnerships. I'd been turning down investment offers for months, preferring to maintain control of the business, rather than accept outside money that might come with strings attached. "I can explain everything when I get home," I told Michael. "It's not as complicated as it probably sounds." But it was exactly as complicated as it sounded, and we both knew it. I'd built a multi-million-dollar business while pretending to run a small craft operation. I'd established myself as a significant player in the jewelry industry, while allowing my own family to believe I was amusing myself with hobby projects. I'd achieved the kind of entrepreneurial success that business schools study while maintaining the facade of someone who needed guidance and support to make basic life decisions. The confrontation, when it came, was everything I'd expected and worse. I returned home to find Michael, Patricia, and Robert waiting in our living room like a tribunal convened to judge my crimes against family harmony. The magazine was spread across the coffee table, open to the 4-page feature that included professional photographs of my designs, my workspace, and me looking confident and articulate in my role as CEO of Hartwell Design Company. "Sit down, Emma," Patricia said, her voice colder than I'd ever heard it. "We need to discuss this situation you've created." Situation I'd created, as if building a successful business was inherently problematic rather than something worth celebrating. As if my achievement was a crisis to be managed rather than an accomplishment to be acknowledged. Robert was more direct in his anger. "This is unacceptable, Emma. You've been lying to us for months, maybe years, building this company behind our backs, making decisions that affect the entire family without consulting anyone. This isn't how..." A Morrison wife behaves. A Morrison wife. Always back to that, to the idea that marrying Michael had fundamentally altered my identity and capabilities, that success outside their sphere of influence was somehow a betrayal of my marital commitments. Michael himself seemed caught between admiration and resentment. "Emma, this is incredible work," he said, gesturing toward the magazine. "But why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me think you were just making jewelry for fun when you were building something this significant?" "Because you wouldn't have let me," I thought but didn't say. "Because every time I showed signs of taking my work seriously, you and your family found ways to redirect my attention back to supporting your career instead of building my own. Because I learned that sharing my successes with you meant having them minimized, managed, or co-opted rather than celebrated. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it until I was sure it was sustainable," I said instead. I wanted to prove to myself that I could build something substantial before I started talking about it as a real business. Patricia's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Sustainable? Emma, this article makes it sound like you're running some kind of empire. 12 employees, high six-figure revenue. That's not sustainable for someone in your position. That's a recipe for disaster." Your position. Always back to that. To the idea that being Michael's wife imposed limitations on what I was allowed to achieve independently. As if my marriage certificate had come with clauses restricting my earning potential and professional ambitions. "What exactly is my position, Patricia?" I asked, genuinely curious about how she would articulate the boundaries she'd been trying to impose on my life for years. "You're a wife and a potential mother," she replied without hesitation. "You're part of a family with responsibilities and obligations that extend beyond your individual desires. This business of yours, it's going to interfere with everything we've been working toward. Michael's career, your social obligations, your ability to focus on what really matters. What really matters. Never my happiness, my fulfillment, my right to use my talents in ways that brought me satisfaction and financial independence. What mattered was my availability to serve the Morrison family's vision of success, my willingness to subsume my identity into their collective project." "And what happens now?" I asked. "Do you expect me to shut down the business? Fire my employees? Give up everything I've built?" The silence that followed was answer enough. They did expect exactly that. They expected me to dismantle my success, to abandon the people who worked for me, to return to the small, manageable version of myself that had never threatened their sense of control over my life. "We expect you to make responsible choices," Robert said finally. "Choices that prioritize your family obligations over personal ambitions. This company may seem exciting now, but it's going to consume your time and energy in ways that will damage your marriage and your relationship with us." Personal ambitions, as if wanting to be successful in my own right was inherently selfish, as if building something valuable was somehow incompatible with being a good wife and family member. That's when I realized they would never accept my success, no matter how I presented it or how much I tried to make it compatible with their expectations. They needed me to be smaller than I was, less capable than I'd proven myself to be, more dependent on their approval than I actually felt. My business wasn't just challenging their assumptions about my limitations. It was threatening the entire power structure they'd built around managing my choices and directing my future. "I understand your concerns," I said carefully, "but I'm not going to shut down the business. I've worked too hard to build it, and too many people are depending on it now for me to just walk away." The explosion that followed was immediate and predictable. Accusations of selfishness, betrayal, ingratitude. Threats about what this would mean for my marriage, my place in the family, my future security. Demands that I choose between my business and my relationships, as if love and success were mutually exclusive rather than potentially complementary. But I'd been preparing for this moment for months. I'd built my business to be independent of their approval or support. I'd established my identity outside their sphere of influence. I'd remembered who I was when I wasn't trying to fit into their narrow definition of who I should be. I choose both, I said. I choose my business and my marriage. I choose my success and my family relationships. I choose not to make artificial choices between things that don't have to be in conflict. That's when Patricia revealed what this confrontation had really been about. Not concern for my well-being or my marriage, but fear that my success would expose the limitations of their own lives, challenge their assumptions about what women in our family were capable of achieving. "If you continue with this business," she said, her voice shaking with rage, "you'll be doing it without our support, without our guidance, without our protection when it all falls apart, which it will. You're not as smart as you think you are. Emma, you're not as capable as this magazine article makes you sound. And when reality catches up with your delusions of grandeur, don't expect us to clean up the mess." Delusions of grandeur. Reality catching up. The complete dismissal of everything I'd accomplished, the insistence that my demonstrated success was somehow illusory, temporary, built on luck rather than skill. But I'd stopped needing their validation months ago. I'd built something they couldn't touch, couldn't diminish, couldn't take away. And I was about to discover just how much power comes from no longer caring what people think when you've already proven what you're capable of achieving. The war was just beginning, but I'd been preparing for battle while they'd been planning my surrender. And unlike them, I'd learned that the most dangerous opponent is someone who has nothing left to lose and everything to gain from fighting for their right to exist at full capacity. The Morrison family had one final card to play, and they played it with the precision of people who'd spent years studying my weaknesses. 3 days after our confrontation about the magazine article, Michael moved out of our apartment. Not permanently, he assured me, just until I came to my senses about the business and my priorities. "I love you, Emma," he said as he packed his suitcase, his voice heavy with practiced sadness. "But I can't watch you destroy our marriage for some fantasy about being a businesswoman. When you're ready to choose us over this company, I'll be at my parents' house." Choose us over this company. The ultimatum I'd been expecting since the moment they discovered what I'd built. The final test of whether I valued their approval more than my own autonomy, their version of love more than my right to exist as a complete person. Patricia called that same evening, her voice filled with maternal concern that felt like a performance, designed to make me feel guilty for causing family drama. "Emma, dear, Michael is absolutely heartbroken. He's sitting in his old bedroom like a lost soul, questioning everything about your marriage. Is this really what you want? Is some business worth destroying the family we've all worked so hard to build?" The family we'd all worked to build. Except I'd never been consulted about the blueprint, never been asked what I wanted our family to look like, never been given a vote in decisions about how we'd structure our relationships or divide our responsibilities. I'd been assigned a role and expected to perform it without complaint or modification. "What I want," I told Patricia, "is a marriage where my success is celebrated rather than seen as a threat. A family where I'm valued for who I am rather than how well I conform to who you think I should be." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if she'd hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost all pretense of warmth. "You've changed, Emma. This business has made you selfish and ungrateful. The woman Michael married would never choose money over family. But apparently, success has corrupted your values. Success has corrupted your values." As if achieving something meaningful was inherently morally bankrupt. As if building wealth and employing people and creating beauty was somehow evidence of spiritual failure rather than personal growth. That conversation was my liberation moment, though I didn't recognize it immediately. For years, I'd been trying to earn acceptance from people who needed me to fail in order to feel secure about their own choices. I'd been seeking approval from individuals who could only love me when I was smaller than my potential, grateful for opportunities I'd actually created for myself. But Patricia's accusation about corruption revealed the truth about what was really happening. My success hadn't corrupted me. It had illuminated them. It had exposed the conditional nature of their love, the transactional basis of their support, the fundamental insecurity that drove their need to control and diminish the people closest to them. I hired a divorce attorney the next morning, not because I'd given up on my marriage, but because I needed someone who understood legal strategy to help me protect what I'd built. 24 hours of living without Michael's disappointment and his family's disapproval had reminded me what peace felt like. I'd forgotten how much energy I'd been spending on managing their emotions about my choices. My lawyer, Sarah Chen, was a woman about my age who specialized in protecting entrepreneurs' assets during marital disputes. She reviewed my business, documents with the kind of professional admiration I'd been craving from my own family. "This is impressive work," she said, spreading financial statements across her conference table. "You've built something substantial here, and you've been smart about keeping it legally separate from marital assets. Your husband has no claim on the business or its profits." No claim on the business. The relief was overwhelming. Whatever happened with my marriage, I wouldn't lose the company I'd poured my heart into building. The Morrison family couldn't demand that I dismantle my success as the price of reconciliation. But even as I felt relief about protecting my business, I was surprised by how much I still hoped Michael would come to his senses. Despite everything, I loved him. I wanted him to be proud of what I'd accomplished, to see my success as something that enhanced our partnership rather than threatened it. That hope died 3 weeks later when I discovered that Michael hadn't just moved out. He'd been actively working to sabotage my business relationships. Using connections from his family's social circle, he'd been calling my wholesale clients to express concern about my company's stability, suggesting that my personal problems might affect my ability to fulfill orders reliably. 2 boutique owners called to cancel their contracts after speaking with Emma's husband, who seemed very worried about her current state of mind. A third delayed a major order pending resolution of what Michael had described as serious family issues affecting the business owner's judgment. This wasn't the behavior of someone who loved me and wanted our marriage to work. This was economic warfare designed to force my surrender by making my continued success impossible. Michael and his family had decided that if they couldn't control my business, they would destroy it. That's when I stopped playing defense and went on the offensive. I'd been trying to preserve my marriage while building my business, attempting to prove that I could be both a successful entrepreneur and a good wife. But Michael's sabotage tactics proved that he and his family viewed these identities as mutually exclusive. They needed me to choose, and they were willing to destroy what I'd built to force that choice. I called a press conference. Not a big dramatic affair, just a small gathering of local business reporters and industry bloggers to announce Hartwell Design Company's expansion plans. I'd been turning down investor offers for months, but I accepted one that week, bringing in $3 million in growth capital from a venture fund that specialized in women-owned businesses. The investment allowed me to scale rapidly. I hired 30 new employees, opened a second production facility, launched an e-commerce platform that could handle national distribution. Within 6 months of Michael's ultimatum, my company was grossing $2 million monthly and had been featured in Forbes as one of the fastest-growing small businesses in the Midwest. Michael's attempts at sabotage had backfired spectacularly. The boutique owners who'd canceled contracts because of his interference were calling to apologize and asking if they could reinstate their orders. The negative publicity he'd tried to generate had instead created sympathy for me as an entrepreneur, dealing with personal challenges while continuing to build an impressive business. Meanwhile, the Morrison family was dealing with their own public relations crisis. Word had gotten out in their social circles about how they'd treated me, how they'd tried to force me to abandon a successful business, how they'd prioritized their need for control over celebrating their daughter-in-law's achievements. Patricia found herself defending their behavior at charity events and dinner parties, where people asked uncomfortable questions about why they weren't proud of Emma's success. Robert discovered that his colleagues at the law firm were more impressed by my business acumen than by his attempts to position me as an unstable wife who'd let success go to her head. Michael's professional reputation suffered the most. His sabotage attempts had violated several ethical standards for accountants, and word of his behavior was spreading through Chicago's business community. Partners at his firm were questioning his judgment and professionalism. His career advancement, the thing his family had sacrificed my happiness to support, was stalling because of his own vindictive choices. The divorce was finalized 8 months later. I kept the business, obviously, but I also kept most of our shared assets because Michael's interference with my company had been documented as economic misconduct. The settlement was generous enough that I could have retired comfortably if I'd wanted to, but retirement was the last thing on my mind. I was 32 years old, financially independent, professionally respected, and completely free to build whatever life I wanted without seeking permission or approval from anyone. For the first time since college, I belonged entirely to myself. The business continued growing. Within 2 years, we were generating $15 million annually and had attracted acquisition interest from major luxury brands. I turned down offers that would have made me wealthy beyond anything I'd dreamed of, preferring to maintain control and continue building something uniquely mine. But the real transformation wasn't financial, it was personal. I'd learned to trust my own judgment about what success looked like, what relationships were worth maintaining, what kind of life would actually make me happy. I'd discovered that the people who truly loved me were excited by my achievements rather than threatened by them. My mother, who'd watched quietly for years as the Morrison family diminished me, finally felt free to express how proud she was of what I'd accomplished. "I always knew you were capable of extraordinary things," she told me over dinner at my new house, a beautiful space I'd designed myself and filled with my own artwork. "I just didn't know if you'd remember that about yourself." The employees I'd hired became like family, people who believed in the company's mission and values, who were excited to be part of building something meaningful together. The customers who bought my designs weren't just purchasing jewelry, they were investing in craftsmanship and artistry that would last for generations. 3 years after the divorce, Forbes called to discuss featuring Hartwell Design Company on their cover as an example of American entrepreneurship at its finest. The photo shoot was scheduled for the same week as Michael's wedding to his new fiancée, a woman 15 years younger who worked as a receptionist at his accounting firm and had no career ambitions that might compete with his need to be the primary breadwinner. I felt nothing when I heard about his engagement. Not sadness, not vindication, just a kind of quiet satisfaction that we'd both found lives that suited us better than the marriage we'd tried to force into existence. The Forbes cover story came out 2 months later, featuring a photograph of me in my design studio, surrounded by sketches and prototypes, looking confident and creative, and completely at peace with the choices I'd made. The headline read, "Building. Beautiful. How Emma Hartwell Turned Rejection into Revolution." The article didn't dwell on my divorce or my conflict with the Morrison family. Instead, it focused on the business strategies I'd developed, the leadership philosophy that had created such a positive workplace culture, the innovative marketing approaches that had built a luxury brand without traditional advertising budgets. Reading about myself in Forbes, I realized that the Morrison family had done me an enormous favor by rejecting my success. Their inability to accept who I was becoming had forced me to become entirely self-reliant, to build my confidence on achievements, rather than approval, to create a life that didn't require anyone else's permission or validation. 6 months after the Forbes article, I received an acquisition offer that was impossible to ignore. A luxury conglomerate wanted to buy Hartwell Design Company for $890 million, keeping me on as creative director with complete artistic control and a compensation package that would make me one of the highest-paid executives in the fashion industry. I accepted the offer not because I needed the money, but because it would allow me to reach customers I could never access as an independent company, to create beauty on a scale I'd never imagined possible. The sale was announced on a Tuesday, morning in November, exactly 5 years after I'd started making jewelry in the spare bedroom of the apartment I'd shared with Michael. That afternoon, Patricia called me for the first time since the divorce. Her voice was different, smaller somehow, lacking the authoritative tone she'd always used when explaining what I should do with my life. "Emma," she said, "I saw the news about your company. $890 million. I wanted to call and tell you congratulations." "Thank you," I replied, meaning it. I harbored no anger toward her anymore, no resentment about the years she'd spent trying to keep me small. Her limitations had become my liberation. Her fears had forced me to become fearless. "I also wanted to apologize," she continued, her voice catching slightly. "We didn't understand what you were building. We thought we were protecting you from disappointment, but we were really just protecting ourselves from feeling inadequate next to your success." It was the most honest thing she'd ever said to me, and probably the most honest thing she'd ever said to herself. I appreciated the apology, but I didn't need it anymore. I'd built my peace on my own accomplishments rather than other people's acknowledgement of them. "I appreciate you saying that, Patricia," I told her. "I hope you know that I never wanted to hurt anyone. I just wanted to be allowed to become who I was capable of becoming." We talked for another few minutes, carefully avoiding any discussion of Michael or the possibility of reconciliation. When the conversation ended, I felt closure not just with Patricia, but with the entire chapter of my life when I'd needed other people's approval to feel worthy of my own success. That evening, I stood in my home office looking at the framed Forbes cover, the business awards lining my shelves, the photographs of my employees at company celebrations. But what made me happiest wasn't the external recognition. It was the knowledge that I'd built all of this by trusting my own vision, following my own instincts, refusing to let other people's fears limit my possibilities. The Morrison family had tried to teach me that love required sacrificing my dreams for other people's comfort. Instead, I'd learned that the people who truly love us want us to shine as brightly as possible. They celebrate our successes rather than feeling threatened by them. They encourage our growth rather than trying to contain it. I was no longer Emma Morrison, the wife who'd given up her career to support her husband's ambitions. I was Emma Hartwell, the entrepreneur who'd built a business empire while learning to love herself enough to refuse relationships that required her to be smaller than her potential. And that transformation was worth more than $890 million, though I was grateful to have both. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.